Welcome to the Brightpoint Operations channel. I'm Sarah Wilson, a fractional COO and operational turnaround partner for small to medium businesses. Today on the channel, I am pleased to invite Dr. Evan Hoffman, who's a conflict resolution specialist, known in the industry as the conflict doctor with over 20 years of experience across broad things. Evan, welcome and thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
Thank you, Sarah.
I gave you a brief introduction and I gave our viewers a brief introduction to you, but would you mind telling our listeners what you're all about, what your background is? I know I didn't do you justice.
Well, thank you. So, yeah, I would say like the largest umbrella for my work has been under the banner of conflict resolution. And I've been really lucky keeping that as the major focus to see like that applied in so many different contexts. And so I've done work overseas with the UN, different peace building projects under the banner of conflict resolution, working with the Ottawa police to design one of the first ever conflict de-escalation programs for officers, and then of course lots and lots of work with different organizations and families and so on, helping in different ways with conflict and resolving conflict.
Wow, that is incredible. Such a wide array of experience, and I'm so happy to have you on the channel today. I thought conflict resolution was a really important topic for our audience because conflict is something that I think, and tell me if I'm on the right track here, that we all dread, but nobody can avoid in the workplace, that is.
Well, tell you if you are on the right track. You are 100% on the right track. Yeah. So conflict, and this is a classic line I use in a lot of my training sessions as an opener. And I say, conflict is inevitable. To be a human being on this planet and part of families and part of organizations and, living your life in the world, conflict is part of our human experience, right? And it's when you define it as, I'm bumping up against someone else in terms of I have my self-interest and I'm pursuing those throughout the day. You have your self-interest, you're pursuing those throughout the day. It's inevitable that we're going to have conflict. And so the goal with a lot of my training and some of the key messages isn't always like we want to make conflict disappear. In fact, in some healthy democracies and government systems and organizational governance systems, you want to have conflict, right? Because you want to take an issue or an idea or a point and you want to say, let's debate it. Let's look at both sides of this. Let's try to explore, different perspectives. And by taking the time to do that, hopefully you land on the very best decision. So the idea is not to make conflict disappear or go away or even if we wanted to. It's about how can we navigate through conflict in a way where we can express it in constructive ways. So that's one of the major distinctions we usually make in the conflict resolution literature is like you can, of course, express your conflict destructively, which, we're all too familiar with those kinds of behaviors and patterns, right? So name calling and, any kind of physical, verbal abuse, violence, threats, all of that stuff is of course bad and we want to avoid that. So if you can navigate through a conflict in a way where you can express your needs, your concerns, your interests in a way where you don't harm the other person, and if they can do the same thing, then hopefully you land on a solution that everyone's happy with, right? So
Yes, and I think that's such a great view on it. And I think that in a workplace, it can get very easy to be in that conflict avoidant mindset, right? Not wanting to experience that discomfort that can come with conflict when it's maybe perhaps a bit negative, and we actually want to encourage people in the workplace as an example to be more proactive, because what I heard you say about the learning that happens when there's conflict, and that conflict actually creates a dialogue that is really productive. And I think we forget, and in the interest of forgetting that, we go to avoidance almost right away.
hmm well, that's because of those negative things I talked about, right? Who wants to step into the middle of like, something that creates anxiety for you, or someone's yelling, or someone's upset, or there's high tensions? Like, it's understandable if conflict is being expressed in those more negative, destructive ways. Of course, we would want to avoid that. You don't want to step into that. And, in the literature, there's a classic model that says there's different conflict management styles. And one of them is to be conflict avoidant. So There's a quiz you can use that helps you to find out your dominant style. And I find a lot of times people are conflict avoidant because, again, it's one of those skills where we were probably never taught, how to engage with conflict in a constructive way. So it's very natural for a lot of us to avoid conflict, but that can be strategically sometimes the right thing to do. Not that avoidance is always bad. Like sometimes you could say, hey, I don't have the energy for this. I don't have the time. I don't have the resources. I am going to strategically just not engage in this conflict because I'm not, well equipped. And so I'm going to avoid it at this time, right? Now,
Yes.
the trade off with that, though, is that while you've never, all of those other potential benefits of conflict that you kind of alluded to there, like hearing about someone else's perspective or
Yeah.
sharing your perspective or trying to make your concerns and put those out on the table so the other person knows your concerns, right? And finding a solution and finding a good solution. Like all of those potential benefits, if you choose to strategically avoid, you're limiting yourself from ever having those kind of benefits. So you kind of do this mental calculation and you say, am I better served avoiding this conflict?
Yes.
Or am I better to engage in it, somehow and try to advance my interests and advance my needs and try to resolve this, right?
I think in the workplace, and I've heard it a lot in the type of leadership training I've taken in my own journey, is sometimes having the managerial courage. It's almost like I would kind of rename that or put a bit of a subtext in having managerial courage. A really big part of that pie is to be comfortable with navigating conflict and one of those people who runs towards it. I like to think that I am myself one of those people, but I wouldn't have before meeting you put the label of conflict on there. I would have just said, I really endeavor to have managerial courage and kind of left it at that. So it's been an interesting opportunity to reflect for myself when I think about framing it in terms of conflict resolution.
Yeah, and that courage is a really important word, Sarah, because, it takes courage to sometimes to say, hey, this is going to maybe be uncomfortable for me. This might be unpleasant. I may get attacked or whatnot, but I'm going to intentionally, as a leader, a manager, a supervisor, a lot of times it's a lot easier to turn a blind eye to a problem and,
It
and,
is.
and kind of sweep it under the rug or, what do they say, kick the can down the road or say, it's not my problem. And if I ignore it, maybe it'll just kind of fizzle out.
Yes.
And in a lot of my experience, like very rarely does a conflict fizzle out. Like it might kind of go under the surface a little bit and kind of die down a little bit and it might linger and kind of fester, but and then maybe a week, 2 weeks later, a month later, 3 months later, if the root causes have never been addressed, because you're pretending the conflict's not happening, it's going to reemerge. And then you'll be surprised and say, wow, gee, I didn't see that coming. Like I didn't even know there was
Yes.
an issue there and I kind of forgot it. And so that courage again is super important. And just as a quick example of where I saw this in my own life, there was a meeting I was at. It was a regular one of the previous organizations where I worked, we had regular meetings every month, and they were pretty long meetings. They would take the whole afternoon. And, there was a conflict within the team that everyone, I think it's fair to say, was aware of the conflict,
Yes.
and including our manager, our supervisor. And what happened in one of these monthly team meetings is it kind of bubbled up to the surface and because it was ignored, it was kind of festering under the surface and being expressed in these more passive aggressive ways, right? And so I was sitting back saying, gee, this is really interesting. This has come up to the forefront now. Here's a really important opportunity where you could almost feel people were hurting and really wanted to engage with it. And let's get this out in the open
Interesting.
and let's address this and then we'll all be kind of better off, right? Like after we have a chance to talk about this. So as it kind of fully emerged at this meeting, I thought, well, this is a beautiful opportunity for us to
Wow.
address this as a team. Here we are, we're all gathered here. We can talk about it. And instead, what happened is the leader didn't have that courage. Maybe they didn't have the confidence. Maybe they didn't have the skills to guide the group through it. So
Yeah.
instead, what they did is they picked up the agenda and they went, we're running out of time. We're almost out of time here. We gotta move on to the next item and let's keep going. And just completely tried to like cap it and stuff it down and plow on to the next thing. And I thought you could feel the energy shift in the room at that point. And I thought, gee, what a lost opportunity for
Lost.
whatever reason this person didn't want to engage at that particular time. A missed opportunity for us as a team to really say, let's be open and honest with each other. Let's get this out on the table. let's try to address this here and now, and we'll be better off hopefully tomorrow for doing so. So courage, yeah, courage is huge.
That I love that example. I mean, I'm sad for the result, but I'm really glad that you shared that because it brings me to the thing I've been reflecting on is that first example that we kind of kicked off with, workplace bullying, the behaviors that were kind of loud and easy to see in our face. There's that kind of conflict in the workplace that gets, labeled very easily as conflict. The less easy to recognize is those quiet, smoldering kind that are, passive aggressive in the example you just used, that the quiet tension that can exist, in a virtual meeting because two of those participants have something going on underneath the surface. And I almost feel like those are the harder ones. I've had and been in rooms where the big blow up happens, and once you get over the shock of it, sometimes getting the feelings out right away makes it easier to move on. Whereas the quiet smoldering ones, those are so much harder to navigate sometimes. What have you found?
Yeah, I'm with you 100%, Sarah, and I think that's a really great observation. And those, as you noted, the big ones that are kind of in your face and they erupt and you say, okay, we don't have a choice in some ways but to address this now. Those are the obvious ones, but the more difficult ones, as you mentioned, are these bubbling under the surface, expressed through microaggressions, expressed as passive aggressive comments, leaving someone out of email communications, all of these other more subtle under the surface ways. And it'd be harder almost to measure like all of the negative impacts of that, right? Because we don't really know, what is that doing to productivity and bottom line and efficiency, and what does it do for the whole workplace culture? How could you measure the impact of those kind of conflicts where everyone's kind of aware of like there's all these tensions under the surface but they're never fully kind of acknowledged or addressed because no one's ever taken time to have a meeting and say, hey, we should come together as a team and talk about some of this. So yeah, those ones are probably arguably even more difficult to manage than the big
Yes.
ones. And in terms of that notion of them kind of lingering under the surface for weeks and months, you could imagine how that kind of situation could just kind of smolder on for months and months and months, maybe until there is a major flare up, or maybe you would see other signs or symptoms like maybe rapid turnover, right?
Mm,
Or absenteeism. And you would start to say, what's going on here? How come, or two people refusing to work together never, if I was the manager in that situation, I'd be saying, I suspect there's something going on here that, I may not be aware of that everyone else is aware of. So, yeah, that's maybe one of the reasons why they don't get addressed. It could be that the folks on the front line and so on really are aware of those tensions and they're living in them day to day, whereas maybe the supervisors, the managers, the
yeah.
leadership is not even aware there's a problem happening, right?
I had an example in my own work where I had a bit of that tension with someone on the team, and I actually went through it that people noticed, and I worked really hard to kind of get over it and
Mm-hmm.
really see that person for their talents and their gifts, and it took some time. And what I learned from that, because I eventually kind of came to really appreciate them and respect them, a couple things that struck me is that when I had resolved things with that person, but people still thought we didn't get along and actually brought it up to me. And I was like, wow, like you guys noticed. I thought I was being professional and I thought it wasn't something that I was showing. And then we had
Mm-hmm.
long moved on from it, gotten to a better place, but it still had an impact on my reputation. And then what I found that was really challenging is that as a leader, a team leader, when I tried to help team members of my own navigate their conflicts, it like I was trying to say almost do what I did. It's like get to know them and get to know their gifts and like see them as a person and all the things that I used in my own toolkit, trying to get others to do that. Even as someone who's been a leader for a really long time, I struggled to try and get my team to use the same tools. I was so stuck. I mean, have you seen this?
Yeah, that's an amazing example. And so, a couple of thoughts come to mind. First of all, you're talking about, or again, organizational culture, and you're talking about modeling the behavior for everyone else, right? And so I think that's a huge component of trying to make a shift in the workplace about how do we express our conflict, right? And if you see some people that you look up to, or that are your supervisors or your managers, and you say, hey, look at how they're managing that situation. Look at how they're treating that person. Look at how they've engaged with that person where they can express their concerns in an assertive way without being, harmful or hurtful. Hopefully, through social learning theory, you'd say others might, kind of replicate those behaviors or pick up on them. And you're setting the tone and you're setting the examples. So that's interesting. And I think what you also mentioned there is the notion almost of reframing it in a way where could we go like starting after today, could we look at conflict not as something to be avoided necessarily, but those difficult conversations we have to have, or those conversations we have to have with people that we don't historically get along with. Imagine you could reframe it and say, this is an opportunity for me to practice my staying calm. This is an opportunity for me to practice my assertive communication skills. This is an
Yes.
opportunity for me to try to model the type of behavior I want others to use in this workplace. This is an opportunity for me to, use problem solving techniques and really try to, and so don't view the person as the problem. And this is a saying in the literature as well. They say, be tough on the problem, but soft on the people, right? And so
Mm.
could you reframe it and say, look, this is a really amazing opportunity for me to put these things into practice and to practice what I preach and walk the walk and talk the talk. And I'm going to take this conflict not as something to be feared or avoided, but I'm going to take this conflict as an opportunity to try to grow and change the workplace culture and set an example for others. And I think that's kind of what you were saying, is that you use some different tools, different approaches, and you were hoping others would pick up on that, right?
Yes, and I like what you're saying about culture building. In my own leadership journey, I think when I was early in it, I wanted to project, perfection, and I very much strove towards that. And I almost had this experience one day where I was sharing some, we were in a kind of work environment, but it was a little more personal. I think we were out as a team, and I said something along the lines of, I did insert something with my kids, and I had one of my team members go, "Oh, thank God." I said, "What?" They're like, "Well, you're human." And it to imply that I was made of Teflon, or that I
Yeah.
wasn't. And I went, my goodness, like, is this trying to project the perfection? It's actually not doing anybody any favors. For me, it's not, it's making me less relatable.
Yeah.
So I've just had so much more success when I honestly say, hey, here's something I've encountered and I have trouble with, and
Hmm.
I'm going to model what I want to see in others. And I've done much better on this back half of that, doing that approach, being more relatable, and it's just more real as a leader of an organization. You should be modeling what you want to see from your team.
I love that. I mean, for me, that's a major kind of shift of worldviews where you're saying, let's look at people around us who are struggling and say, like, maybe they're not necessarily a bad person. Someone who gets angry, we seem to have a tendency in our culture to say, here's an angry person who blew their lid or got really upset, and they're somehow an immoral or unethical person. But could we reframe that and say, hey, we all get frustrated. We all have a tough day. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes for this person. Maybe they've, got unprecedented stress at home with a sick family member or financial pressures, or we don't know what's going on in their life, right? And if so, it's a fundamental shift of worldview to say, you're a human, I'm a human. Let's recognize that and going forward, and let's have compassion for, where we're at and where you're at in your journey and the struggles that you're having. And in my own professional journey, I've found over the years that that part of me has become much more pronounced, where, like, I'll give an example. I didn't mention this in my intro, but I also do a lot of teaching and training at different universities and so on and so forth. And I used to think, like, here's a policy for like late papers for student assignments and essays, and the university has set out this policy. It's the role of the instructor to, you must administer this policy, and that's that. And if someone has a late paper, penalize them, right? And I thought, well, that's my job. I'm implementing the policy. And as my compassion has grown, where a student is saying, my pet has just passed away, I'm worried about my tuition for next semester, I'm running really behind. Can I have a couple extra days for this paper? I think the old me might have said, well, no, the policy is the policy. You have to take the late
Yes.
penalty. The new me that sees that sense of shared humanity and compassion, recognizing I have tough days, you have tough days as a student. Sure, I'm happy to give you another day or 2 days to finish up. And then they often are so thankful and so relieved and, phew, wow, thanks. I really feel like much better now. And now I'll do a better paper and I'll get a better grade and then I'll feel good about that. So, compassion, recognizing the shared humanity goes a long way and is valuable in many, many different settings and contexts, right?
Evan, I love that about the shared humanity and that almost those little mini impacts that you just talked about. Whereas, I'm so relieved, therefore I'm going to do a better paper, get a better grade, and in the end feel even better about the whole thing. They're going to feel better about themselves. They're going to feel better about you as an instructor. I love that shared humanity and bringing that to the workplace because I would hazard a guess that if you were to survey your own workplace today and go, what percentage of conflict that exists is because person A and person B are equally passionate about what they do, and they're passionate about their role, they're passionate about doing well,
Mm-hmm.
getting their job done on time, meeting their goals, and but the way they see it might be different than the way someone else sees it, and that's where the conflict comes in. But at the root of it, it's both of those people just wanting to do the best that they can, yet that type of thing just escalates into that negative conflict. Not even, it goes past the productive conflict we just talked about and into that danger zone of erupting into something not so great.
Yeah, that's a really great point there, and that's a tough one because you're really again talking about worldviews and think about how that could play out. Like I gave a workshop not too long ago on worldviews in the workplace, and one of the examples we talked about was there's a funding deadline coming up, and you have two people who are responsible for writing the project proposal. One of them says, according to my perspective, according to my worldview, we should be doing major consultations, we should be collecting input from lots of stakeholders, and we should take our time, not rush the process, and write a really good proposal, even if that puts us past the deadline. Whereas, so that was their worldview, that was what was important to them. The
Yes.
other person in this conflict is saying, hey, I've seen us get bogged down in endless stakeholder consultation processes. I've seen us miss past funding deadlines. In my worldview, yes, it's important to do stakeholder consultation, but it's also important that this is a funding deadline that's coming up, and we should just, put together the, the proposal as quickly as we can and just get something in so we meet that deadline. And so you've got these two fundamentally different, slow and steady and thorough and detailed versus, we got to quick and nimble and reactive and let's go quickly kind of thing. And how do those two people reconcile that, right? And in that workshop, someone actually shared an amazing story that I'll pass it along. They said, gee, I have an example of someone having a worldview conflict at my work. Can I share it? And I said, sure. So they said there was someone was away sick for a couple of days and then they felt better. They came into their work and they went to their workstation and they took out a chemical cleaner and disinfectant and they started wiping down all the equipment in the shared work area with these chemicals. A coworker said, hey, put that poison away. What are you doing? You're going to poison me. And, I don't want any chemical in the workplace. So one person is saying, here's something I'm doing as a courtesy to protect your health. I'm going to disinfect everything. The other person is saying, that's not a courtesy. You're actually invading my space and putting harmful chemicals in here that I don't want to breathe in. So again, who's right, who's wrong? This it's
It's
hard
not
to say.
intentional, right? No,
Yeah,
yeah. I think we mistake I love that example. I think we mistake intention where there isn't. Like I think if we often, and I love that term worldview, by the way. I feel like when I say it that it's less selfish, even though it's acknowledging that what I think is my perspective. And I think we forget that sometimes when we hear people say something that we don't agree with, we get emotional about it in part because we're frustrated that that person has said something that we do not believe to be true. Whereas when you say, in when you preface something with "in my worldview" or "in their worldview," that's all of a sudden like that almost calms your brain a bit by saying that person is speaking from their perspective, remember? And then you go, yeah, and then you're almost setting it, you're almost just by changing the word you use, approaching it with more compassion and more empathy, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely. That's an amazing idea right there. And it's such a small change you could make where, but it's just what you're kind of doing is framing and saying what I'm about to share is what's true to me. And this is how I'm viewing things from my perspective. And I recognize that others might not be seeing everything the same way I do. And just
Yeah.
kind of putting that as like a disclaimer in a way, right? Where it's like, I'm going to share how I see things and I recognize you may see things differently and let's take it from there kind of.
Yes, and I think it's by even, even selecting the word, it does a better job of sometimes people preempt and they go a bit far and they by saying, "Oh, well, this is just what I think," and they use too many words that maybe takes away from the impact of what they're trying to say and the confidence that they're
Mm.
projecting. So I like that word essentially can work so hard for us. That's incredible.
Hmm.
Yeah, the if we were to speak directly to, a leader who's listening to the show today about, gee, I have this conflict in my team and it's festering. What would be kind of a takeaway for somebody, as a leader who's obviously listening because they're interested in conflict resolution, and what would be
Yeah.
a takeaway that you might give someone listening on what they could do in their own workplace that would be helpful?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this almost seems too simplistic to share it, but it's the truth. And it's about communication. I mean, I think, as a general rule of thumb, in almost any given conflict, be it between, two family members, two neighbors, you almost always, always, always want to increase the communications and find new means of communicating, open new communication channels. Like, think of an analogy with international relations, right? And when there's a crisis or tension brewing between two countries, what's the first thing they do? They cut all communications, they pull out their diplomatic staff, and it's almost the exact wrong thing to do because you're making it harder to communicate with the other side, right? And think about what they did in the Cold War with between the United States and the USSR at that time. They created a telephone hotline between the two countries so that they could open up a new channel of communication and there wouldn't be an accidental flare up of military, you know, fighting between the two of them, right? So there was this telephone line to open up the channel of communications. So if you're a leader who's listening right now and you're saying, I'm have a conflict happening at my work, and again, it sounds almost so simplistic that it sounds kind of silly, but how are we communicating? Am I creating opportunities to communicate around this? Should I call a meeting? Should we have an outside facilitator to run a dialogue session? Should I try to collect people's input around, what are their hopes and fears and concerns and interests? Maybe I should invite feedback from the team. So it's communication sounds simple, but when you put it into practice, it's like who's communicating with whom, and what types of communications are we sharing? So I would say that's where I would start in almost any given conflict. Look at creating more opportunities and channels for sharing of information, for communicating. And sometimes you have to intentionally like create that space or create those channels or create those opportunities. And then that allows you to find out again what everyone's concerns are, what the issues are. And then you can move from there to kind of like planning what's the most appropriate next step. Like, do we have to have the facilitator? Do we have to have a mediator? Do we have to change a policy? Do I have to send out a memo to everyone? Right. So you kind of do your second step after you kind of figure out what's going on, and and that's through communicating.
And that's really great. And I would add to that, even sometimes as a leader, maybe you've had access to training, maybe someone's been able to take, in a conflict resolution training. And sometimes if we've been a leader for a really long time, we may have tools in our toolkit that maybe people on our team don't. So we always have to remember that, to be open and really receptive to how it's going for whoever's within that conflict, because we might say, oh, it's just easy enough to solve it this way or that way.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who are deep in the conflict may not have access to the same tools as we do.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, I didn't mention this in my intro as well, but I get invited into a lot of different organizations from different industries, and a lot of times, sometimes, there's been an issue in the workplace, then they say afterwards, gee, we should have conflict resolution training. That a little bit more rarely is sometimes they're more proactive and say, hey, we should give everyone here conflict resolution training before something happens, which is a really good perspective if you have the resources and capability. But a lot of organizations who invite me to come in and do training with them, they say that's one of their rationales, right? They say we want everyone to have a common vocabulary, a common language, a common understanding of what conflict is. We want everyone to be equipped with, so they're building up the capacity of their folks to manage conflict on their own before it can escalate, which is, in terms of return on investment, a small amount on training everyone so they have the capacity to and confidence to engage with conflict constructively. You can imagine that was going to save a lot of money and other negative impacts that will be prevented. So yeah, so capacity building, skills training, all of that stuff is super important as well. And you don't have to wait till something has happened. You could say, hey, we have a little bit of a training budget. We should be doing this now before something does happen. Yeah.
I agree, and I think that's such an important investment to make. And I think the ROI is something that's even tough to measure, but like really high upside, but high potential. Because to your point about him making the investment beforehand, what a great way to smooth the way in advance for our teams, right? So I absolutely love it. That's great. Well, Evan, I would love you to share where people can find you, because I can't thank you enough for joining the channel today. Where can people find you if they want to find out more about the services you offer and what you're all about?
Yep, thanks for that. So head over to conflictdoctor.ca. That's my website. You can see more about my training,
Excellent.
coaching, facilitation services, mediation services, and so on and so forth. Conflict Doctor.
Excellent. I will, for those watching the episode, have that linked in the comments. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Evan, and thank you to our listeners and watchers. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you next time.